Okay. So I'm going to talk just generally about production practices and then some tips for establishment based on experiences that we have had working with people and establishing our experimental plots. Talk a little bit about pruning, fertilization, then results from the variety trial that I did, and then some odds and ends problems that we encountered or other people have encountered that we've worked with. So the first thing that I'm going to cover are the 5 blueberry commandments. So Gordon and I came up with this list a couple years ago when we were doing these blueberry educational programs, and we were talking to all these people who were interested in growing blueberries and or had started trying to grow blueberries. And blueberries are kind of, well, they're very different than many other crops that we grow. So how many people have seen a wild high bush blueberry growing somewhere out in the, yeah, I wish I had a picture of one. I've seen enough of them. So that, where do they grow? In the understory. Okay, so they tolerate some shade. They might even like a little bit of shade. What's the soil like where they grow? Acidic. And the other thing is that they're usually growing in an area that's a little bit wet, but not too wet. So when I'm out canoeing or wherever and I see them, usually they're growing up on a tussock. They're not in standing water. They might be on the bank of a stream. The soil's moist, but it's not soggy. The pH is low, and there's high organic matter. So we're trying, blueberries are really easy to grow if you plant them in the right spot. But most of our soil is not the right spot, so we have to try and recreate that blueberry habitat in a field, which is sometimes challenging depending on what type of soil you have. So these are the 5 commandments of growing blueberries, what you need to do in order to make the habitat what the blueberry likes. If you break one of the 5 commandments, your blueberries might be okay. Probably if you break the first commandment, you're done for. But if you break one of the other commandments, the blueberries might make out okay for a little while. But if you break all 5 commandments, it will be L for your blueberries. So the first commandment is that you have to adjust the soil pH between 4.5 and 5, and you need to keep it there. It's best and highly recommended to do that before you plant the blueberries, because it's much more difficult to do it afterwards. And the way we adjust soil pH is by adding sulfur, elemental sulfur, and incorporating it. So before planting, that's the only chance that you're going to have to incorporate sulfur and get it worked through. And it takes at least a year for the sulfur to fully react to lower the soil pH. The sulfur lowers soil pH through the action of microbes in the soil. The microbes are not active when it is cold. So anything that is happening is going to happen when it's warm outside and the soil is warm. So before planting, it's highly recommended that at least a year ahead of time you are working to get the soil pH to 4.5 or 5. This handy table is in the Mid-Atlantic Berry Guide, which is a resource which is very helpful, but a little bit hard to come by these days. So depending on your soil texture type and your starting pH, this is how much sulfur you need to add in order to get to that either 4.5 or 5 range. Okay, the only reason that you would target 5 rather than 4.5 is if you're going to do, if you know that you have a situation where you know that your management practices after you plant your plants are going to continue to lower your soil pH or keep it low, because 5 is the top of where you want to be. So if you know that your irrigation water is acidic, or that you're using highly acidic mulch material, or there's some other factor that's going to keep your pH low, then you could lower it to 5. But really, you want it to go to 4.5. Then after you're planting, you need to test pH annually and adjust your fertilizer use to keep the pH between 4.5 and 5. There are a lot of things that can cause the pH to go up, depending on what you're mulching with, whether your irrigation water is not so acidic as you thought maybe it was. And so you need to keep monitoring your soil pH, and it is possible to go too low and lower your soil pH into a range where the blueberries aren't happy. We have had somebody do that. He had to lime his blueberries. Okay, so the second commandment is to amend the soil by adding organic matter, and it has to be low pH organic matter. So you can do this. There are options. Before planting, you have more options. You can plant a cover crop. You can incorporate low pH organic matter. People have typically used pine bark fines in this area. You can use anything that is low pH and low salt. At planting, we recommend incorporating 1 gallon of peat moss with the backfill soil for each plant. We did a study with Hale Bennett Orchards looking at what happens if you add more than that, so like 2 and 3 gallons of peat moss with the plant. That is detrimental. And I'm going to show you an experiment we did where we looked at some alternatives to peat moss to see if there's something that might be accessible that was cheaper than peat moss to add at planting. And then after planting, you add organic matter by mulching with some sort of organic material. So the purpose of adding the organic matter in a sandy soil is to increase water holding capacity, and the purpose in a heavier soil is to improve drainage, because blueberries like it to be moist, but not too moist. They don't like clay at all, and they don't want to grow in pure sand. So these are the results from an experiment we did where we tried different amendments added to the planting hole. So this study, the only thing that we did different for these plants was we put was the 1 gallon of stuff that we put in the planting hole at planting. So peat moss is the orange line, and that's our positive control. That's what we recommend. Then we had some alternative materials, pine bark fines, or just like screened pine bark mulch so that you just get the little tiny pieces. Screen chip construction waste was a relic from one of Gordon's previous projects where he ground up a poultry house structure. And, there was this, ground up poultry house. So it was wood chips, tiny wood chips, which we screened. Then we tried waste silage that had gone bad, and horse bedding as possible alternatives to the peat moss. And then the green line on both these charts is no soil amendment. So this is the yield over the however many, 7 years that I took yield data for this trial. So you'll see that yields were lower at the beginning, then 2016 was a bad year. We'll talk about why later. And then the last 2 years, yields were sort of reaching where they should be on a fully mature plant. So this is yield in number of pounds of fruit per plant. So orange line, our positive control, the recommended practice, was in the top, definitely at the beginning and continuing on towards the end. Some of these other materials, alternative materials, seem to be working okay, but the green line is pretty low. Then this is a more telling chart. This is the cumulative yield. So this is how much total yield we got over the time period. So you can see that adding nothing to the planting hole, those plants did not establish as well, and they continue to be behind in yield compared to the ones where we added some amendment. And the amendments that performed well were peat moss, the recommended pine bark fines, and that ground up poultry house. But comparing no amendment to peat moss, we had 7.5 pounds less yield off of the no amendment over those years. So these plants where no amendment was added were just slower to get going, and they may eventually catch up with the ones that started out well, but you've had lower yields for all the previous years. So it's likely that over time you're never going to catch up the potential yield. So, and the reason why these no amendment ones are able to keep going is because every year we're adding 2 inches of wood mulch. So we are increasing organic matter in the field overall by adding mulch. It's just that these plants where we added the amendment in the planting hole got off to a better start. So it's good to add organic matter at the beginning in the planting hole. Okay, so I just talked a little bit about mulch. So mulch is another of the blueberry commandments. Mulch has multiple functions. First one is to suppress weeds. Second is to keep the root temperature cooler, the way blueberries like it. Remember, they grow in the shade in the wild. The third is to try and keep the moisture level more even. And then the added benefit of increasing soil organic matter over time, which is actually really important because that peat moss that you added at the beginning is not going to be there 20 years later when your plants are still going. So there are some different options for mulch materials. We did a study where we looked at some alternatives to sort of the pine bark or wood chips, and I'll show you that in the next slide. There are, in this area, most people are using wood chips. Pine bark mulch is fairly expensive, and there are some potential disease issues with using pine bark mulch. Waste hay or straw works okay, but there are some disadvantages to that. In other areas, depending on what waste products are available, they use all sorts of things as mulch for blueberries. They use cranberry leaves as mulch for blueberries. Some areas of New Jersey and New England, because they have a lot of cranberry leaves from cranberry processing. You will have to look around and see what you can get low cost or free, because mulch can be a big expense. Okay, so we looked at a couple of different mulch options. One thing we looked at was horse bedding. Then we had more of Gordon's chipped up poultry house. So that was wood chips, but more like construction waste, so no bark in it or anything. Corn stalks, like from a round bale. Waste hay, pine bark, and then aged wood chips. So one thing that we noted was that some of the mulch materials were raising the soil pH. So this was a year and a half after planting. There was the horse bedding treatment, pH had gone higher than 5 in the soil in those plots. And then by 2015, the horse bedding was above 5.5, so that's really problematic. The chipped construction waste plot was getting close to 5.5, and then these other materials were going up slightly. The soil pH was rising slightly in there, but there were significant differences for these first two materials, and we tested the pH on the materials, and obviously you can tell why the horse bedding and the chipped construction waste were raising the pH of those plots, because they have much higher, the materials themselves have a much higher pH. We really couldn't take the pH of the corn stalks or the waste hay. That didn't really seem like it was going to work out. So that's why there are no bars there. So when you're using alternative mulch materials, you need to be careful about what they might do to your soil pH and account for that. The two things that most people are using in this area do not tend to raise the soil pH. All right. And then these are some pictures from the mulch materials study that give you an idea of how well they were performing as far as suppressing weeds. So horse bedding, not so much. There's just, that was some shavings. I think, Brian, you provided that.
Yeah.
Yes. So there really wasn't a lot of big chunks of lignin-filled material to suppress weeds there. The corn stalks did a fairly good job of suppressing weeds, and they were an okay mulch. The thing that drove me crazy about them was that they would float away whenever we had a rain event where there was water moving around. So that kind of was aggravating. And and pine bark mulch, so that's the sort of standard but expensive treatment. And waste hay worked pretty well, but not so great, not as good on the weed suppression front. And I'll mention also, in my blueberries at home, what I use as mulch is essentially waste hay. I have a big meadow area at home that we mow, and then use that as mulch because it's free. But that doesn't add organic matter to the soil the way using wood chips does. If you're going to use wood chips, it's important that they are aged. So some people get them in ahead of time and let them sit for a year or two before they put them out. That is, they need to sit for at least that long. All right, irrigation. Blueberries live in wetlands, and they need approximately 2 acre inches of rain or irrigation per week. They do not, their root systems are very shallow. They do not make deep roots because they're growing on tussocks and they don't like wet feet. So they don't put roots down into the water. They wait for the water to sort of come up to them. And they're living in that moist, organic soil that's hanging out on top of the sandy bottom layer that's soggy. So their roots don't tolerate drying out very well, so they need timely irrigation. Most people are using drip irrigation and doing drip lines with the more permanent installation. You want to put 2 rows of drip line, one down each side of each row, because the blueberry roots are only going to be growing and making use of nutrients in the soil that's moist. If you're irrigating through a prolonged dry spell, the roots on the side of the plant that doesn't have an irrigation line are all going to die. And also, they're not very good, apparently, at moving nutrients from one side of the plant to the other side of the plant. So they're not going to be have their roots thriving on the side where there is no water. So 2 lines per row. Of course, if you have a drip irrigation system, you can use that to fertigate. And because it's a more permanent system, you need to have in your plans a way of cleaning it out every year, because you're going to get sediment and stuff in there that's going to clog things up. It's good to work with somebody who knows what they're doing with a more permanent drip irrigation system if you're going to install that. Overhead irrigation can have advantages, especially in the establishment years, because it wets everything, and the plants are not going to have roots growing out into all the areas where you might have drippers. So if you're using only drip irrigation in the establishment years, it's really important to make sure that where your plants are, they're getting water, and where the roots are is getting water. As the plants get bigger, it becomes slightly less of an issue. The overhead irrigation systems can also be used for frost protection if that's a concern in the area where you're at and with the varieties that you're using. As I mentioned before, blueberries don't tolerate flooding, and so in areas, if your field area is prone to flooding, then you should consider planting on top of raised beds. And then the last commandment is to control weeds. So the strategies for that would be start with a clean field. Don't put it in a spot that's weedy to begin with. Keep your mulch looking good and doing its job. You really need to mow the row middles religiously or maintain them bare or mulched. One thing that drove me crazy in the variety trial, because of course it's a randomized complete block design and I have all the different varieties all mixed together, is that some would be done fruiting, and I could have done some herbicide spraying in there, except that they were right next to the other ones that were still fruiting. So you can avoid that problem by planting varieties together that mature at the same time, so that when they're done fruiting, you can go in and take care of some weed control issues, because there's basically like no weed control options during the fruiting period 30 days beforehand through harvest. So if you want specific herbicide recommendations, which I highly recommend reading, the New Jersey commercial recommendations have the most up-to-date recommendations there, and the Mid-Atlantic Berry Guide has some recommendations, but I would say look at New Jersey's guide for all the pest control options. And it's pretty much unavoidable so the tedium is pretty much unavoidable. You're going to have to pull weeds by hand and or spot spray very carefully to keep weeds out of a blueberry planting. They are using landscape fabric in some areas, like especially the Pacific Northwest. I don't know anybody who has been really satisfied with the results of using it in this area. You don't get the benefit of adding organic matter with the mulch. You have probably more issues with roots heating up. And yeah, this isn't the Pacific Northwest here, so. That would solve a lot of weed control issues if we could do that, but it doesn't seem to work. So those are the 5 blueberry commandments. Adjust the soil pH to the desired range, add organic matter, mulch, irrigate, and make sure you control weeds. As far as establishment, some things that we have observed and experienced. Make sure that you're following the 5 commandments, and you need to be ready before the plants get there. The soil preparations, as I mentioned, should start at least a year before you're planning on planting. The irrigation system should be installed before the plants arrive. Or very close to it, because you don't know what the weather is going to do. And if you experience really hot, dry weather right after planting, you're going to be scrambling to get water on those plants. You can dig holes before the plants get there, and then you can put the peat moss or whatever amendment that you're going to be using into the hole. That will save you some trouble as far as trying to wet the peat moss. If you're just adding peat moss, like directly at planting, you have to add moist peat moss. And moistening tons and tons of peat moss is not a fun time. So if you break up those bales and measure out your peat moss and put it into the hole ahead of time and let it rain on it for a month or so, then the rain will do the job of wetting the peat moss for you. And you need to have your mulch on hand, because as soon as the plants are in the ground and you have drip lines out there, then you want to get the mulch on there. Usually planting is happening in the early spring with dormant plants. I tried planting some plants in the fall in the variety trial just because of when I was able to get them from different people. I did not find that to be good. That was just my experience with that one, a couple of varieties, but they were much slower to establish than things that were planted in the spring. If you can get larger plants, that's better to a point. 2-year-old plants are generally what's recommended as far as being cost effective and being large enough to establish quickly. I did plant some little tiny plants in the field too. It's possible to keep them alive. You just have to work harder. And you can get plants either bare root or with media on them. Usually they're like pooled plugs, so they're those I would say are pretty nice. I would say they're nicer than the bare root plants. Yes, sir.
Going to your amendment and your establishment.
Yes.
If I look at that picture and you have a pretty good size install that somebody's doing, how are they doing their prep? Are they just taking a crew out there and using shovels and just hand digging holes and doing that size of a run and doing the amendment?
Yes.
I didn't know if they were augering or if they were.
Well, this is our plot, and we dug all those holes by hand. I think, I don't know what Bennett's did. They might have something, since they are planting fruit trees, that would dig a hole faster than a shovel. Yeah, no, they were ready when the plants came. You don't, and because it takes time to dig all those holes, you don't want to be doing it when your plants are sitting there waiting to go in the ground. And then finally, nurseries will run out of varieties that are desirable, so you might not get what you want if you wait till the last minute. And then a few more things about establishment. Your goal in the first 2 to 3 years is to promote vegetative growth as much as possible. So that includes removing all the flower buds or the flowers or the fruit as early as possible in the season. So it's desirable to remove flower buds so that they don't turn into flowers. If you don't get the buds off, then you have to remove the flowers. If you get fruit on there, you still want to get the fruit off before it ripens. Whenever you can get out there and take that stuff off, if you get fruit on there and you say, oh, well, I'll just, no, take it off. As long as it's green, you'll be making a difference. But the earlier you can get it off, the better. So the first 2 years, no fruit, only leaves. In the third year, you want to reduce the number of flower buds during pruning is the best time to do this, so that the plants don't produce a full crop. You need to pay a lot of attention. And by the way, if you have a huge planting, that's a lot of work to take off all those flower buds. In the first year, you can do it mostly through pruning, and then go back and take off any flowers after the fact that you missed. The second year it gets a little more challenging because, of course, plants are bigger. And then pay close attention to your watering so that your plants do not get stressed. Like I said, making sure that the water is ending up where the plants are, and then providing timely nitrogen fertilization in the first year. And if you don't get those plants established, they're not ever going to thrive, and they're just going to be behind everything else. Okay, pruning. So pruning happens in February and March. There's fairly small amount of pruning happening in the establishment years, mostly to remove flower buds. As you get later, as your plants get older, the goal is to have about 15 canes, all of which are less than 5 years old. And the strategy or the sequence that you can follow in general is first take out all the dead wood, then see what new growth there is from the previous year. Keep 3 canes that are 1 year old and remove the rest. And then look at the older canes and take out 1 of every 6, prioritizing the oldest ones. So with blueberries, you want to take out the oldest wood and keep the youngest, but of course you don't want all of the youngest because that's not the most fruitful. And then the older wood is also less fruitful. I have usually spend a fair amount of time then pruning out low branches because nobody wants to pick down there, and they get hit by the mower, and then thinning any twiggy, so extremely branchy wood, as much as you have time for. There are differences between varieties and how easy they are to prune. If you read these instructions and then go look at a blue crop plant, you will say, everything makes sense. if you read these instructions and then go look at some of the varieties that grow more like a woody shrub than canes from the ground, you'll wonder what I'm talking about here. So with those ones that are woodier, like Chandler, Sweetheart, are some of the varieties that have more of that growth habit. You just have to try to encourage new growth, prune out older material, and thin out the twiggy stuff, I guess is my best advice. And pruning is a really good time to look at your plants and decide, are there 3 good new canes that grew last year? If not, then try and figure out what's going on because your plants aren't happy. And evaluate plants for vigor and prune accordingly. So if you have a plant that's less vigorous, then prune off flower buds. Don't let it fruit so much. Encourage it to make leaves. And then these are before and after pictures from some different varieties and how they got pruned. So there's blue crop. It shoots up a lot of canes straight from the ground, and you just prune off the old ones and move on with life. Then there's this variety that makes a lot of twiggy growth. You can see there's a lot more twigginess in there. Draper is a variety that makes a lot of sort of wimpy little shoots from the ground, which are really annoying to prune off. Enrica has a growth habit more like blue crop, maybe a little shorter in that picture. Okay, fertilization. One rule of thumb for evaluating whether your nitrogen fertilization is adequate is to do that evaluation when you're pruning or late in the summer. Do you have new canes that are exceeding the height of the old canes, or at least equaling it once your plants get very large? So in some of the really vigorous varieties, you might have to go in and top them at the end of the summer. We had to do that in some varieties in the variety trial because they were getting too tall for me to pick. And so with potassium and phosphorus, you want to apply those before your planting goes in based on your soil test results. And then nitrogen is applied annually using either urea or ammonium sulfate. Blueberries prefer the ammonium form of nitrogen. They don't really pick up nitrate. So these are the 2 sources you want to use. If you want to keep your soil pH where it is, use urea. If you need to lower your soil pH, then use ammonium sulfate. Depending on how old your planting is going to determine how much nitrogen you're adding. And then the nitrogen application should be split with half applied at flowering and half 6 weeks later, which is around here, usually the beginning of June, when fruit is starting to size up. For other nutrients, we recommend using tissue tests in later years to determine what the status of the plants are. All right. Okay, so the variety trial was looking at mostly varieties that are newer. Blue crop was the standard old variety, and these varieties came from different breeding programs. And one of the goals was to look at some of the southern high bush varieties to see if they had a fit on Delmarva. And this planting was in Georgetown, which is like right there. So all the red ones down here are southern high bush varieties. This is Vaccinum corymbosum crossed with other Vaccinum species that are native to the southern U.S. and that makes them more heat tolerant, but also more cold sensitive. So because cold sensitivity was a Concern with the southern highbush varieties, I looked at frost and freeze damage on buds each year. So some of them, like Misty and Star and Arlen, had really significant freeze damage to flower buds every single year, practically. Whereas there were some other southern highbush varieties like Lenore and Jubilee, where there was very little freeze damage. So some of those might fit. This is what the freeze damage looks like. And the year, these are flowering dates, so for different varieties. So these are the flowering dates for Aurora, which is a late variety, so it's flowering later. And also Liberty is another late variety that's flowering later. Down here are some varieties that generally flower earlier, but in 2016, all the green bars, everything flowered earlier, and then it got frozen, and that's why yields were terrible. So the point of this slide is that there are some varieties that are going to avoid freeze events because they flower later. There are some varieties, especially the southern highbush varieties, that tend to flower earlier, and they are more susceptible to freeze damage, especially in years when we have bad freeze events. You have this slide, which is really terrible to look at. These are all the varieties and their yields over all the yield data. They are ordered based on the black bar, which is the average yield over all those years. So these are the higher yielding ones, which is fairly obvious. The lower yielding ones. This chart just has the last 3 years of yield data, so it's not so horrible to look at. And I'm going to talk more about yields when I go through the varieties more specifically. We also had a trial with Hale Bennett at Bennett Orchards, and he had many of the same varieties, but he also had a variety called Nelson, which I did not have in my trials, which looked pretty good in his trials. You have this in the handout, and I'm not going to talk too much about it, but we did some taste trialing, and we're looking for varieties that people thought were good, that most people thought tasted good, and not too many people thought tasted terrible. At least that's what I'm shooting for. But, you know, you can decide what you want. Okay. Because I have very little time left, I'm just going to flip through these pictures of the varieties really fast, and I'm not going to talk about them because you can read this handout, which is all my comments about them. And so these first several are the recommended varieties: Nelson, Chandler, Legacy, Blue Crop, the standard, Lenore, a southern highbush that seemed to work well, Sweetheart, a newer variety from New Jersey that seems pretty nice, tastes good, Rika, this one's from New Zealand. It did well in the trial. It's extremely early, but it's also very sour. Blue Gold, Darrow, Draper, this is the one that came on in the later years and looks really good yield-wise. Aurora is a later variety. Jubilee is a southern highbush with good yields, but some other issues. So that's recommended with reservations. Beaufort is one that was added to the trial later. It's a southern highbush variety. It looks really good yield-wise and quality-wise. Okay, other stuff. So bugs. We used to not have really so many bug problems, especially in this area for blueberries. Now we have spotted-winged Drosophila, which can be an issue, especially in later varieties. If you have an established planting, then you can get all the bugs that they have in New Jersey, and you'll have to deal with them. But generally, not so many bug issues beyond spotted wing. Birds will show up in your blueberries eventually. Depending on the habitat around, there will be more or less of an issue. You can use netting. You can use scare devices, which work for a while until the birds get used to them, which they always do. Or you can use the deterrent bad tasting stuff. Or have an overwhelming number of blueberries so there's enough for you and the birds. But I don't know about produce food safety issues with that. So netting will keep the birds out, but you might lose your mind in the process of putting it on and taking it off. We used a scare device like a noise-making device in our plot. It worked for a while until the plants got really big and the birds figured that whatever that hawk was that was screaming at them couldn't see them because they were hiding in a blueberry bush. And it also drove Mark Van Gessel out of his mind. I think he broke it. To avoid disease issues, you should start with plants from a reputable nursery. You can have diseases come in from wild plants nearby, so keep that in mind if you have woods nearby with wild blueberries growing in them. And I had root disease problem, Phytophthora cinnamoni, come in on pine bark mulch in my planting, which became a problem. So watch out for that. Just a little bit about marketing. There are a lot of people who would like to you-pick blueberries, but you can't rely on them to pick all the blueberries. They don't like to pick when it's hot. They don't come pick when it's raining. And you'll have to do some of the picking yourself. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of nasty blueberries in there that are spotted-winged Drosophila breeding grounds. And make an informed choice when you're deciding your marketing plan, and then make your variety selections accordingly. And if you're doing a lot of picking and your pickers don't want to be picky, then you can get some small-scale grading equipment that can sort of clean things up afterwards if your pickers just like to. No, you don't. So what we did was we put the backfill soil, the soil that came out of the hole, onto like a piece of plywood, put the peat moss on there, mixed it around, and then put it back in the hole with the plant. So you need to incorporate, if the peat moss is already in the hole, then you should probably scoop it out, mix it with whatever soil that you're putting back in, and then put it back in with the plant. It has to be mixed in with the backfill soil. Yes, so the recommendation in the Mid-Atlantic Berry Guide is to fertilize in the planting year the same, so half of it at bud break and half of it 6 weeks later. And on Delmarva soils, I would definitely say that that is recommended.
And I'm saying pre-plant, so your slide wasn't you're doing it after it's stored after.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So there's no, nitrogen should be applied at flowering and 6 weeks later when the plants are actually growing. They don't have very good root systems.
Okay, thank you, Emily.